All right, last little bit here of, I believe, chapter 6. As you can see, a summary, so nothing really new, but a good chance to go back through some of the ideas that we've learned about in the rest of the chapter. So let's get into it. Dewey says, since a number of points have been discussed, it will be well to round up conclusions reached about them in a summary statement of the structure of the common pattern of inquiry. So what unifies or is common among all different kinds of inquiries. Inquiry, he says, is the directed or controlled transformation of an indeterminate situation into a determinately unified one. So a situation where something seems out of whack, out of order, not sure what's wrong, something seems off, into a situation that hangs together, fits together, makes sense to us. The transition is achieved by means of operations of two kinds, which are in functional correspondence with each other. One kind of operations deals with ideational or conceptual subject matter. The subject matter stands for possible ways and ends of resolution. So we've talked about the conceptual, the role of the conceptual, the role of ideas as pointing the way to possible solutions, possible operations we can do that will change the environment, hopefully help us solve our problem or give us further information that we can use in order to understand our situation. So that was the first thing, right? The subject matter stands for possible ways and ends of resolution. So ways and also kind of projecting the desired end of the inquiry, as well as the means that we might possibly take in order to reach that end. This ideational content, it anticipates a solution and is marked off from fancy. So there's distinction between hypothesizing, as you might see in science, or just kind of the other ideas that you might use in trying to solve an actual problem, is marked off from what he calls fancy, because or insofar as it becomes operative in instigation and direction of new observations, yielding new factual material. So it's different from, say, daydreaming, where you're just fantasizing about possibilities, but you have no real intention to put that into action. So he's making a difference between these two, what we might call mental operations, although there's reasons to avoid the word mental, but ideational, conceptual, imaginative, whatever word you might want to use there. But there's different kinds, right? And so here we're talking about imaginative contents that are going to actually be used potentially in changing our situation. The other kind of operations is made up of activities involving the techniques and organs of observation. So different kind of thing than imagination, where you're imagining new possibilities, than these ideational operations, where you're imagining what could happen, what possibilities might we undertake, is different than observation, looking and seeing what is actually there, or listening, smelling, all that stuff. Since these operations are existential, they modify the prior existential situation, bring into high relief conditions previously obscure, and relegate to the background other aspects that were not at the outset conspicuous. So you're changing kind of what stands out in the situation. You move around, for example, in order to observe. Observe is not just standing still and looking, although it can be that. Even in that case, maybe you're looking carefully at things you did not look at carefully before, ignoring things that maybe don't seem so important now, but there's also other kinds of observations, actually manipulating the environment to get a better feel for it, a better look at it. And that changes kind of the makeup of the situation for you. So the situation is not given once and for all at the first time you observe it, but the way you observe it can change, and different things stand out, different things fade away. The ground and criterion of the execution of this work of emphasis, selection, and arrangement of these observable materials, right? Observable objects, emphasizing some, selecting some, arranging them. The ground and criterion of this is to delimit the problem in such a way that existential material may be provided with which to test the ideas that represent possible modes of solution. So testing our ideas, right? So selecting particular objects of observation in order to test a particular idea about what might be the case. Symbols, defining terms and propositions, are necessarily required in order to retain and carry forward both ideational and existential subject matters in order that they may serve their proper function in the control of inquiry. Otherwise, the problem is taken to be closed and inquiry ceases. And we'll talk much more about symbols and terms and propositions in other chapters, but there is an important role to play for symbols, for language, right? This is, of course, a part of the conceptual apparatus, the mechanisms by which we imagine, but it also changes observing, our observations. So how we talk about stuff, what we choose to point out using words. A philosopher around the same, a little bit younger than Dewey's generation, but kind of same era, talked about conversation as a kind of perception, right? You're conversing in order to figure out a situation, make the situation clearer. So there's an important relationship between language and observation, or other kinds of symbols and observation, that's not just about imagining possibilities, talking about possibilities. But that will be explored much more fully later on in this book. So next paragraph here. One fundamentally important phase of the transformation of the situation, which constitutes inquiry, is central in the treatment of judgment and its functions. The transformation is existential and hence temporal. So things are happening in time. Change is taking place to existential things in the existential world, the real world, the practical world. The precognitive unsettled situation. So the situation where something is not quite working out, but we haven't really thought about it yet. We just noticed that there's some issue. Something's not working right. Something is unsettled. Something is confusing. But we have not yet analyzed the situation. So precognitive. The precognitive unsettled situation can be settled only by modification of its constituents, by modifying the parts of the situation. Experimental operations change existing conditions. You try things, see what happens. Reasoning, as such, can provide means for affecting the change of conditions, but by itself cannot affect it, right? Reasoning doesn't itself change the situation, but it can change how we see the situation and change what we do, right? Provide more reasonable options for actually changing the situation, but there has to be that actual intervention, physical intervention into the situation. Only execution, as he says, only execution of existential operations directed by an idea in which ratiocination terminates can bring about the reordering of environing conditions required to produce a settled and unified situation. Yeah, so that's kind of what I said in a little bit more complicated language, but I think that's a very precise way of saying it, right? Execution of existential operations, so actually doing things in the world that are directed by an idea, which is the outcome of ratiocination or reasoning. Only this can reorder the things in the environment to settle the situation, have it make sense, solve our problem. Since this principle also applies to the meanings that are elaborated in science, the experimental production and rearrangement of physical conditions involved in natural science is further evidence of the unity of the pattern of inquiry. So this holds for what we've been calling common sense inquiry as well as scientific inquiry. The temporal quality of inquiry means then something quite other than that the process of inquiry takes time. It means that the objective subject matter of inquiry undergoes temporal modification. So it's not just that an inquiry, of course, takes time to do, but also it kind of results in changes to the situation. And this, too, is, of course, a kind of temporal modification. So the subject matter of inquiry changes, not just our ideas, or not just the process of inquiry taking time, but actually everything. You can say that everything changes, of course, right? But the situation changes as well. And then he ends with a terminological note, which is important just for understanding how Dewey is using words here, and this reinforces some of the distinctions we have been talking about, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. So let's look at this terminological note that ends the chapter. He says, were it not that knowledge is related to inquiry as a product to the operations by which it is produced, no distinctions requiring special differentiating designations would exist. This is a kind of an important point, kind of repeating something that has been mentioned before, but it's easy to forget these little comparisons that Dewey makes. So knowledge being related to inquiry as a product to the operation, as a product to the operations by which it is produced. I keep reading that a little bit wrong, but so knowledge is produced by inquiry. A product is produced by certain operations. These are similar things, right? Knowledge is the outcome of inquiry, just as a certain product is the outcome of certain operations that produce that product. And so certain important distinctions need to be made since this is the case. So material would merely be a matter of knowledge or of ignorance and error. That would be all that could be said if things were otherwise, right? So this is not how we're going to think about it. Material would merely be a matter of knowledge or of ignorance and error. So either you know about something or you don't. That would be all that could be said. The content of any given proposition would have the values true and false as final and exclusive attributes. But, and this is kind of how a lot of people think about it. We either know about something or we don't know about something, but that something is always kind of just there, and it's up to us or circumstance or luck or whatever, or our own interest as to whether we know about it or not. Statements are true or false, and that's all there is to it, right? There's kind of a stable truth always there. But, Dewey continues, but if knowledge is related to inquiry as its warrantably assertable product, and if inquiry is progressive and temporal, then the material inquired into reveals distinctive properties which need to be designated by distinctive names. So knowledge is not just always there waiting to be found out. It's something created. It's an outcome. It's a product, right? Warrantably assertable. It's something that we can assert as being the case, that we find out that we have good reasons for saying this is the case in this particular situation. After going through this progressive inquiry over time, that changes things. So because, well, if you take this view of knowledge, then there are some important distinctions to make. As undergoing inquiry, the material has a different logical import from that which it has as the outcome of inquiry. So the material that we're working with, when we're working with it, it has one status. When we have finished our inquiry, it has another status. In its first capacity as undergoing inquiry, in its first capacity and status, it will be called by the general name subject matter. So when we're working on something, investigating something, experimenting on something, it is subject matter. When it is necessary to refer to subject matter in the context of either observation or ideation, the name content will be used. So the content of an observation, the content of ideation, imagination, will be used, and particularly on account of its representative character, content of propositions. What are propositions about in the context of an ongoing inquiry? So that's subject matter. The name objects will be reserved for subject matter so far as it has been produced and ordered in settled form by means of inquiry. So as an outcome, all right, we're producing an object, working with subject matter to produce an object. Proleptically, objects are the objectives of inquiry. Proleptically is a fancy word, just kind of like to anticipate or looking to the future. Objects are the objectives of inquiry. That's what we're trying to get to, is the objects. The apparent ambiguity of using objects for this purpose, since the word is regularly applied to things that are observed or thought of, right? We also talk about the object of thought or the object of our observation, is only apparent. So this ambiguity of this word object. For things exist as objects for us only as they have been previously determined as outcomes of inquiries. So he's saying that what we take to be objects are things that have already been settled by inquiry, or we take them to be settled, right? They may turn out to be, there may turn out to be more to it than we previously thought, but the kind of stable objects, what we take to be stable objects in the world, are not just given to us, but they have been settled by inquiry of some sort. Not, of course, not necessarily and not usually scientific inquiry, unless you're a scientist looking at scientific objects. But we've had to figure out what all this stuff is in the world around us. We weren't just born knowing what all these things were. Let's see where I am. For things exist as objects for us only as they have been previously determined as outcomes of inquiry. That's an important sentence, I think. When used in carrying on new inquiries in new problematic situations, they are known as objects. They are known as objects in virtue of prior inquiries, which warrant their assertability. In the new situation, they are means of attaining knowledge of something else. So because they're relatively settled, their outcome is not really in question. They can be used as means to get knowledge about something else. And of course, that's all provisional, contingent. Things could turn out to be more complicated than we at first thought, or less settled than we at first thought. In the strict sense, they are part of the contents of inquiry, as the word content was defined above. But retrospectively, that is, as products of prior determination and inquiry, they are objects. Okay, so anyway, we'll be trying to keep straight some of these distinctions between subject matter, something we are inquiring into, stuff we're working with in the context of an inquiry, the contents of observations and ideations in an ongoing inquiry. And then at the end of inquiry, the world gets turned back into objects. The object that results from inquiry, the objective of inquiry, right, is to produce objects that are known, that we can have warranted assertions about, that we have good reasons for describing in a certain way or organizing in a certain way. Okay, and that is the end of Chapter 6, and in the next video we will start Chapter 7, The Construction of Judgment.